We show you the whole picture.
Hello, I'm Esther Gidou-Ewart. Welcome to Africa 54. Here's what's coming up.
The month-long war between Israel and Hamas has turned into an urban street battle as international leaders continue to call for a temporary ceasefire to allow humanitarian aid to enter Gaza. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs says heavy rains across parts of Somalia have displaced more than 100,000 people. And in our health report, Africa 54 health correspondent Linord Moudou talks to a doctor about rare diseases and the challenge they pose to global health. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that after the war is over, Israel plans to maintain security control over Gaza, home to over 2 million Palestinians, for an unknown period of time. His comments came during an interview that aired late Monday on ABC News, an American television network. Netanyahu, however, ruled out any general ceasefire without the release of the more than 240 hostages taken by Hamas in its October 7th attack on Israel. But he says he is open to, quote, tactical little pauses. Israel's military on Tuesday released video of what it says are strikes on Hamas targets near a hospital in northern Gaza. The army says it was targeting a Hamas base in a building adjacent to the Al-Quds hospital where an attack was being planned. The strike led to secondary explosions, which the army says indicated the presence of a Hamas weapons cache in a civilian area. The Israeli army also says it has taken a Hamas military stronghold in the north of the enclave, saying anti-tank missiles and launchers, weapons, and various intelligence materials were seized. United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker Turk said on Tuesday that he is extremely worried about the situation in Gaza. He spoke following his meeting with Arab League Secretary General Ahmed Abul Gheit in Cairo.
It's the 1-month anniversary of this incredible escalation of violence that we have seen. I'm, of course, from a human rights perspective, extremely worried about the situation, about what is happening, and it is really important that a solution is found to end the violence and to get out of this.
10,000 Palestinians. The month-long war between Israel and Hamas is intensifying on the ground in Gaza. As civilian casualties mount, U.S. and international leaders are calling for a temporary ceasefire to allow humanitarian aid to enter Gaza. But Israel insists that the humanitarian crisis of its 240 hostages must be resolved first. Linda Gradstein reports from Jerusalem.
In Israel, the public is focused on the fate of some 240 hostages, including 30 children. Demonstrations in support of the hostages are intensifying, with demands that Israel not agree to a ceasefire or allow humanitarian aid into Gaza until the hostages are freed. Former hostage negotiator Gershon Baskin says he believes most of the hostages are still alive and being held in underground tunnels in Gaza.
They are probably being cared for as hostages in a situation like this might be cared for. I don't believe they're being physically tortured. They probably have minimal food necessary to stay alive and water, and maybe even a little bit of medical supplies, but they are still seen by Hamas to be valuable assets to free Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails.
Israelis say the hostage kidnappings and brutal murders of 1,400 Israelis, most of them civilians, as well as the rising toll of soldier deaths in the ground invasion of Gaza, have profoundly shaken their sense of security.
Israeli society has never been as mortally wounded as we are now. It's not only the mass numbers of casualties and the hostages, but it's also the way in which 1,000 Israelis were butchered the helplessness of how they died. And that negates the founding ethos of this country. Israel was created to be a safe refuge for the Jewish people. Not the promise of Israel was not that there would never again be genocidal enemies, but that never again would Jews die helplessly.
In Gaza, civilians are also feeling helpless. The high death toll and widespread destruction has left the 2.2 million Palestinians terrified and forced many to flee their homes. Although the Israeli army has warned civilians to evacuate the northern part where its ground operation against Hamas targets would be concentrated, there were recently several Israeli airstrikes in the southern part of Gaza, which was supposed to be a safe zone.
When they bombarded us, I lost consciousness. My brother, Zaid, and 2 cousins were martyred, and a third is still missing. And the owner of the house and his son died too. Perhaps more than 10 people were martyred, and everybody else got injured.
The central Mughazi refugee camp also suffered from Israeli airstrikes, which terrified the children of Palestinian journalist Rami al-Megheri, a Mughazi resident. He says that international negotiations on the future of Gaza are the only way out.
I believe politically, the pressure politically could come out with something tangible, could come out with sort of a breakthrough in the upcoming period that would lead to some sort of a lasting solution for Gaza.
A solution to the conflict will only come after much more fighting wipes out the Hamas military infrastructure, according to Israeli political and military officials. But even Israel's steadfast American allies are beginning to exert pressure to allow a temporary ceasefire, a demand Israel has so far rejected. Linda Gradstein, VOA News, Jerusalem.
For more on the Israel-Hamas war, joining me from Tel Aviv is reporter Ricky Rosen. Ricky, what more can you tell us about this conflict?
Well, today we heard reports of more tunnels being uncovered by the Israeli army as they continue their advance into the heart of Gaza City. We also saw that a so-called humanitarian corridor was opened by the army so that Palestinians could go flee away from the northern area of Gaza, where the fighting is concentrated. And we saw images of Palestinians walking and in cars, holding white flags as they made their way south. Also today, South Africa joined the several Arab countries and South American countries in calling its ambassador to Israel. And so far, there was no comment by the Israeli Foreign Ministry. But last week, they responded to the actions of the other countries by saying that they were expecting these countries to condemn Hamas terrorism.
Ricky, today also marks the first month since Hamas attacked Israel. How is this day being remembered in Israel?
It's a very somber day. There's a Jewish tradition that 1 month after a death is marked by prayer and mourning. And so you can imagine that thousands of Israelis are marking this 1 month after the death of 1,400 people. Flags were lowered in all the cities. There's a special prayer vigil at the holy site of the Western Wall where candles were lit. And there's also anger on the part of the families of hostages who had a rally in front of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, demanding that more intensive efforts be exerted to bring back their family members who are being held hostage in Gaza.
Ricky, many thanks for your reporting. Ricky Rosen, live for us from Tel Aviv, Israel. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs says floods caused by heavy rains across parts of Somalia have displaced more than 100,000 people and affected hundreds of thousands more. Rachel Faber has more.
Floods caused by heavy rains in Somalia have displaced more than 113,000 people and temporarily affected hundreds of thousands. That's according to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. At least 10 people have died in the aftermath of the floods, and the government has declared a state of emergency. Fadumo Abdul Qadir is staying at an internally displaced persons camp.
It is raining on us for the 5th day. Lying in the rain killed 2 elderly women. Our shelters were washed away. Children are missing now. We do not know whether they are dead or alive. We request the aid agencies to urgently help us. This rain is a disaster. We are in water. We have taken shelter with our neighbors and we have nothing to give to the children. We have no shelter. We have no strength. We wait for help from God. And please pass our request to the aid agencies so they can help us urgently.
The rain comes a year after Somalia suffered its worst drought in 4 decades. Christoph Hodder is a climate security and environmental advisor at UN Environment Somalia.
There is quite a big irony around people fleeing for the fact that they don't have water and now fleeing because they have too much water. And so it's a real dichotomy or problem that we're seeing. And the IPCC report quite clearly says that this cycle of flooding and drought is going to continue. And we're going to see this more and more unless we really do something on a global scale to try to reduce these and try to stay on this Paris 1.5 alignment.
The UN says the drought, combined with violence and a rise in food prices caused by the war in Ukraine, has killed as many as 43,000 people. The current October to December rainfall season has seen intense downpours across a large swath of the country, driven by El Niño.
That was Rachel Faber of Reuters reporting. A new study released by the Africa Center for Strategic Studies says China trains nearly 2,000 African military officers annually at military and political academies. The study says China sees professional military education in Africa as an opportunity to promote its governance model while deepening ties to Africa's ruling political parties. VOA's Paul Ndiho is standing by with the author of this report, Paul Nantulia. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Esther. How are you?
Paul, I'm doing well here. Let me know, because you have actually covered a couple of, stories on China in the continent itself. First of all, share with us briefly what your encounter was, and then we hear from the expert standing next to you.
In addition to China training military officers in Africa, it has invested nearly $1 trillion in Africa. But from our perspective, I'm here with a celebrated researcher who has done an incredibly good work on Africa, investment in China, China investment in Africa, Paul Nantulia, who is going to give us more insight of what has been happening between the two continents. So you've recently released a study that talks about China's investment in Africa. Let's start there.
Right. Yes. This report looks at Chinese military investments on the African continent, specifically looking at professional military education and the opportunities that China is providing to African militaries to send their officers to attend different Chinese military academies. It's part of a series of reports that we've released under the Africa Center for Strategic Studies that is looking at this really significant aspect of Chinese engagement.
Paul,
yes.
You've done a lot of work on China-Africa investment. Why is China interested in Africa?
China is interested in Africa because, one, it needs allies. It needs support for its global ambitions. Africa has consistently come on top in terms of the kind of diplomatic solidarity that is extended to China. In UN multilateral organizations, African countries always vote to defend Chinese positions. And China is also looking to build influence not just in Africa, but also in other parts of the global south. So we see this multifaceted approach, economy, military, security, education. China needs allies, and China is looking to buy influence around the African continent.
Well, it looks like we've run out of time. Thank you so much, Paul.
You're welcome. Welcome.
Esther, back to you.
Thank you, Paul. That was VOA's Paul Ndiho speaking to Paul Nantulia, the author of China's Military Political Work and Professional Military Education in Africa at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies here in Washington. Still to come, how Liberia is fighting youth drug abuse. We'll be right back.
This week on Straight Talk Africa, a discussion on the African Growth and Opportunity Act. AGOA provides duty-free access to the U.S. market to a number of African countries. The program is up for renewal in 2025, but U.S. President Joe Biden wants to discuss improvements with Congress before reauthorizing it. African businesses are concerned because they want to make sure it is renewed in time. Join me, Haiti Adams, as my guests and I delve into the significance of AGOA on the continent. That's on the next Straight Talk Africa.
In other news, police say a manhunt is underway for the assailants who robbed South African Transport Minister Sindisiwe Chikunga and her bodyguards of their guns. Police say the tires on Chikunga's car were punctured by spikes, causing the car to stop, enabling the criminals to rob the occupants of their valuables. An Algerian court has sentenced French-Algerian activist Amira Bouraoui to 10 years in prison in absentia for an illegal exit from the country, according to media reports. Bouraoui, who fled to France through Tunisia in February using her mother's passport, sparked a diplomatic dispute between France and Algeria. And police in Madagascar used tear gas to prevent protests by supporters of the opposition, according to journalists at the scene in the capital, Antananarivo. Jean-Jacques Ratzion, a candidate in the November 16th presidential election, was also briefly detained. According to a 2023 report by the Global Action for Sustainable Development, Liberia is losing an entire generation to drug abuse, with its capital, Monrovia, alone having more than 800 drug hubs and an estimated 100,000 drug users. Senanu Todd has more from Monrovia.
Along the Doo River in Monrovia is a community of about 150 youth notorious for illicit drug use and sales. Those who live here call the area Abule City and say it is a haven for unemployed and frustrated comrades to find some peace. Benedict Souza is a resident and leader of the community. He says Liberia's unemployment has driven many youths to desperation. Many resort to drugs to cope.
Abule contains all of the category of habits. We get liquor people there, we get drugs users there, we get cigarette users there, we get opium users there, we get cool users there. Everybody forms part of our drugs.
Souza explains that while Liberia's unemployment has driven some youth into violent crime, communities like the Abule City provide a kind of security to those who live there.
We don't allow intruders, much like criminals, to come into our midst because you have the community dwellers, it's resting upon us. We agree, these are hard substance that we didn't supposed to do, but because of situations, where it's providing situations, we do it. But now we're standing still. The community understands we are there doing it and know that we are not bad people and will never be bad people.
A 2023 report by the Global Action for Sustainable Development says there are 866 ghettos like the Abule City in Liberia's capital alone. The report estimated that about 100,000 young people in Monrovia are involved in substance abuse. Advocates say Liberia's 14-year civil war in the 1990s and early 2000s bet this epidemic.
Since the end of the Civil War, the issue of drugs started in the country, and at first it was actually being done by the warlords. They were given to the fighters in order to get them brave to the front line, because at that point they cannot be to their senses, so they get them brave to fight. Then after the war, it became a major business now in Liberia.
The Network for Empowerment Progressive Initiatives is a donor-funded nonprofit that uses trauma therapies and cognitive behavioral therapies, CBTs, to help more than 500 former child soldiers adapt into society after the Civil War. Ball says the program is now using the CBTs to help young people struggling with drug abuse.
There are some that are carrying weapons. There are some that, because of the abuse of drugs, they want to maintain that status, they have become armed robbers. So based on our interview, we try to deal with those higher risks that are in the community.
Substance abusers are admitted to the program for 8 weeks, undergoing counseling and therapies that include life skills, training and support for resettling.
When they graduate from the training session, they do not have place somewhere good or safe to go. Those are some of the things we get involved to find a family member and tell them about the importance of accepting the back in their home.
NEPI graduated 314 drug-using youths from its first cohort in August, supporting them with funds so they can re-enter society. With support from former child soldier volunteers, they say they hope to tackle substance abuse in Liberia, one group of graduates at a time. Sana Anutod, VOA News, Monrovia.
It's time for our health report, and here's Africa 54 health correspondent Linord Moudou. Hello, Linord.
Hello, Esther. Hello, everyone. Rare diseases, also known as orphan diseases, affect a relatively small number of people worldwide. They can vary in prevalence between populations, so a disease that is rare in some populations may be common in others. Rare diseases affect some 350 million people. They include Guillain-Barré syndrome and achondroplasia, characterized by dwarfism. The rarity and complexity of rare diseases make them difficult to diagnose and even harder to treat. For more insight, I spoke with Dr. Harsha Rajasima, founder and executive chairman of Indo-US Rare.
Rare diseases are rare because each disease affects fewer than 200,000 people in the United States. That's the definition since the 1983 Orphan Drug Act of US FDA that President Ronald Reagan signed into law. 80% of these diseases are genetic, and some of these are early onset. About half of the diseases start manifesting early during their developmental life cycle, from birth through the first 5 to 10 years. And then there are many adult onset diseases that may already exist in the patient, in the children, but they may not actually manifest those symptoms until later part of their life in their adulthood. They are considered late onset diseases. And about half of the rare diseases are late onset. The total number of rare diseases has steadily increased over the last 10 years as the technology for diagnostics, human genome sequencing has been advancing. The total number has now reached 10,867 known named rare diseases.
What are some of the hurdles when someone is diagnosed with a rare disease?
Essentially, they are left with one of 4 or 5 options, right? So first is they got diagnosed with a rare disease. Second, whether the disease has a treatment option readily available in the market, and can they access it, and can they afford it? Do they have insurance? Will the insurance pay for it? Can they afford the out-of-pocket? Right. So that's the standard of care for any disease. If there is no treatment option, then the patient gets involved or gets referred to a patient advocacy group, which is a hallmark in rare disease The physicians are not trained in rare diseases, or at least not in most rare diseases, and hence they are not necessarily trained to understand and treat many of these diseases because the diseases are not well understood in the first place. So patients become the experts in those scenarios, or the family members and caregivers become the experts. That's the need of the hour, is because they are so rare, you don't have enough patients in any single country, and you got to cast the net wide across the globe, and hopefully you'll have a few hundred patients that you can identify and connect. And that's where the power of digital technology and the internet can be very critical.
You mentioned earlier that technological advancement, medical advancement are enabling more diagnosis for rare diseases. What about the impact of the environment? Is there a possible link with the environment and the development of rare diseases?
And that's a fantastic question, Linord. There are three major components of any rare disease causal factors. One is the genetics, the second is the lifestyle, and the third is environment. And so environmental factors often are neglected or not as appreciated, and it's very important to recognize, like, allergies due to pollen and seasonal changes, or ultraviolet radiation, or various other types of environmental factors, forest fire, and many other things that could affect, each one of these factors might affect different types of disease categories, like respiratory or cancers. There are many forms of cancers that are rare, and then there are genetic diseases that may not manifest until they are exposed to certain environmental factors, including altitude. If they are at a very high altitude on the mountains, or if they are in rural and geographic different parts of the country, all these types of environmental factors can have an impact on whether even a genetic disease will manifest and how severe the symptoms will be.
So as you mentioned, global collaboration is important in fighting rare diseases. Now, talk to us about Indo-US Rare and the steps to foster collaboration.
At Indo-US Rare, we are addressing these massive health inequities on a global scale, focusing specifically on United States and India, and the Indian subcontinent, and the Indian diaspora that have migrated over to US and Europe and the rest of the world. Although we are named Indo-US Rare, we are inclusive and welcoming other countries. We have members from multiple other countries also.
Thanks, Linord, for that report. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.